This is Hollisa Alewine. Welcome back to our investigation, Pharisee, friend or foe. And in the last segment, we discussed the particular groups of people that Yeshua addressed, particularly when he was rebuking those leaders. And that seemed to be when Yeshua issues a lot of these rebukes, they are going to people who would have been considered teachers, members of, obviously, the Levites, the priests, the scribes, and the Sadducees. There's actually more groups than that. If we look at the first century, there's many groups, and sometimes their positions or their viewpoints are completely opposite. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they form alliances against one another. And we'll look at one specific case where that happened. But the point we made in our last lesson was that when Yeshua reprimanded these particular people, including the Pharisees, it was because they were perceived to be judges, leaders, teachers, as the Apostle James said in James 3, that not many of you should be teachers because there's the greater condemnation, there's the greater judgment. And so when we see Messiah coming, if he is a judge, as Messiah was prophesied to be, it talks in the prophets about how he will actually judge, it says, with a sense of smell. That's an interesting one to study. But it says, not by the sight of his eyes or the hearing of his ears, but he's going to judge with righteousness. And where does judgment begin? It begins with the people who are the role models for everyone else. And what we see with the Pharisees as a group, even though today they've come to be called hypocrites, mean, selfish, proud, and all sorts of things, had we asked the average person on the street that question, what's a Pharisee? In the first century, we would have received a much different answer. You would have sensed a lot of reverence for their piety. You would have sensed a lot of respect for their scholarship, as well as for their codes of ethics. There's an entire tractate in the Mishnah called Ethics of the Fathers, or Ethics of the Sages. And they talk in those ethics about what it really means to be what would have been at that time a Pharisee. What would it have meant to have that position, that respected position among the Jews, whether they were from Judea or from the Galilee? And as we learn more about what the Pharisees believed through the literature that they left behind, what we realize is that the Pharisees that Yeshua is correcting, they are behaving inconsistently with their own schools. They're behaving inconsistently with their own ethics. In other words, he's not rebuking the ideal Pharisee. He's rebuking the Pharisee who's acting inconsistently with what a Pharisee should be. And I think this helps account for, like I say, what really got me started thinking about the Pharisees was Paul being so proud of being a Pharisee and identifying. And there was something Paul said when he identified himself as a Pharisee, and it is that one thing that we're going to go after here as we work through the study and as we try to wrap our brains around what it would have meant to be a Pharisee in the first century, not in 2019. What it is today is irrelevant. What it was in the first century, only that is relevant to a Bible scholar. We can't judge a first century Pharisee according to what he's come to mean today. So Yeshua is rebuking those Pharisees who are not practicing what they're preaching. So if they're preaching it, and we know what they were preaching from the literature they left behind, If they know to do good and they're not doing it, it's Yeshua's obligation to point that out. He's going to start the judgment at the top. And he's not doing anything any differently than any other rabbi of the first century, of any other respected leader of the first century. What he's doing is very consistent with what is expected. When a respected rabbi sees violations, he is expected to speak into that situation, not to continue walking and allow the behavior to persist. So, as we peel back these layers of what a Pharisee has come to mean and get down to the core of what a Pharisee actually was, there's some things we want to look for. Who were they exactly? And the only way we can really know who they were is to understand what they believed. That's how you identify someone even today. If you know what they believe, then you know who they are probably as a person. One of these beliefs, and like I say, that's the tip that Paul leaves for us to follow, is that he says he's being arrested, he's being held, he's being accused or charged because of his belief in the resurrection of the dead. And that's going to be the core of what a Pharisee is. He believes in the resurrection of the dead. He also believes in what is known as the oral law, the extra instructions and traditions and so forth that, according to the sages, were passed down to Moses and then continued to be passed down. In fact, there's a Becky book that actually explains that whole process. But once we understand what they believed concerning the resurrection of the dead, then we begin to understand why it was such an important group in the ministry of Yeshua. And that's what we're going to do. We're not going to romanticize the Pharisees. We're not going to demonize the Pharisees. We're going to try to look into the facts, look into the historical facts particularly, so that we as Bible students, we can analyze every reference to the Pharisees, whether it's in the Gospels or whether it's, say, in the book of Acts. And as we read that account, whatever's going on in the passage, that we will have enough information about the Pharisee of the first century that we can apply fair weights and measures that the Word says we have to apply. So that as we try to retrain our thinking in terms of simply throwing them all into this box labeled bad guys of Scripture, that instead we can recognize that there were actually some Pharisees in the Gospels that are held up as examples of righteousness. And there again, as we look at how we arrive at our decisions about what we believe, often when we say this is the way to look at it, it requires us to completely ignore a different example. And that's what we're going to find. The readers, if you're reading Scripture, what you will see if you look at it fairly is that the Pharisees are going to be like the groups within any faith. There's going to be good ones, there's going to be bad ones, there's going to be indifferent ones, there's going to be righteous ones, there's going to be hypocritical ones, and everything on that scale in between. In fact, to the Pharisees' credit, it's in their own writings that we are going to find out what the model Pharisee was expected to have been. Because the Pharisees themselves, like Yeshua, were not afraid to confront the problems within their own group. They will record the good traits that are expected of a Pharisee. They will praise those traits. They will also record the problems that were experienced among people in the group, such as hypocrisy, and they're going to condemn them. In fact, sometimes much more harshly than Yeshua ever did. So, as we move forward, what we do, I want to answer a couple of different questions. One of them we can look at here toward the beginning. And that's that question that only you and I can answer when asked of ourselves. In other words, I'm asking Hollisa, I'm asking me right now, do you stereotype? And then that's the question you have to ask yourself. Do you stereotype? Because it's very easy, because of the way we've been conditioned. It's very easy to mistake a proof text for a stereotype when that interpretation of that text has gone unchallenged. Has anybody before ever asked you, well, were all Pharisees bad? That's a challenge. Were all the Pharisees bad? Well, if you've read the Gospels enough, your answer would have to be, well, no, they weren't all, because there's this example, and then there's this example. Oh, well, I can't say they were all bad. But if I choose to only focus on the bad ones, and as we know, there's a reason why there is a focus on the bad ones. Yeshua, as the judge, the divine judge, he is coming and pointing out the deviation from the standard. So what is a stereotype? I know we're all sick of hearing, the politically correct words, but, there's very little that disgusts us that doesn't have at least a seed of truth. And so where political correctness has gone way overboard, let's look at the good that can come out of it. Because when we're careful not to stereotype an entire group based on the behavior of one, it's a good thing. So let's get a good definition of a stereotype. And then at the end of the study, I want to look at another reason why we might have a bad attitude toward the Pharisees that goes even beyond being conditioned to have a bad attitude about them. When we know that not every Pharisee could be tossed into the bad box. So a stereotype it's a standardized mental picture that is held in common by members of a group and that represents an over-simplified opinion, prejudiced attitude, or an uncritical judgment. And oversimplification, even though I've not used that term up to this point in the prior segments, I have referred to it. Where it said, when I can't make up my mind what the proper interpretation is, I pick one and oversimplify it. And then I have to disregard all this other information in order to do that, rather than having the patience to work through it and acknowledge there's different ways of looking at this. The key here is that whatever this opinion is that I hold, or this stereotype of an entire group, in fact, if you'll remember that famous court scene with Gregory Peck in To Kill a Mockingbird, it's as though he's putting the idea of stereotype also on trial. It's a good old black and white movie. If you've never seen it, it's worth finding it. And he goes through as he's making his case, and he says, we come to these conclusions that says, all these people are this way. All these people are this way. But that's, by definition, an uncritical judgment. What does that mean? It means that whatever you have in your mind, your mental picture of this group of people, it hasn't been subjected to logical analytical standards of judgment. And that's what we want to do with the Pharisees. We want to challenge the stereotype, the modern stereotype that says they were all hypocrites, mean, selfish, proud. Let's subject it to a logical, analytical, and not hysterical standard of judgment. Because along with stereotyping, often what we have is something that goes hand in hand with it. And I know, again, it sounds like a politically correct term, but it applies. If you think very seriously and very honestly about how our thinking of the Pharisees has been handed down to us, or even of the Jews themselves has been handed down to us, we have to admit that there have been times when we viewed them with ethnocentrism. It's become, again, less politically correct today, but ethnocentrism is an attitude that your own group, your own ethnicity, or your own nationality is superior to others. And the more recent trend has been to try to move away from ethnocentrism and instead embrace everything, which is running absolutely in the opposite direction instead of finding that balance. That's saying, just because of my ethnicity, I am not superior to anyone else. But when we put ethnocentricity, that somehow the way I was brought up, the way that I was reared, the way I was raised, is superior to other people groups, you have to subject that, again, to a logical, analytical standard of judgment. Because there might be some things within other cultures or ethnic groups where their way of doing this particular thing or that particular thing might be better, if we can put a value judgment on what's better. But when we're convinced that our way is the absolute best way in the whole wide world, we have to be careful. Because what that can lead to is looking down on other people. And if you pair that up with stereotyping, it's a pretty steep road downhill. So how could those things have influenced even our own reference books? Unless you're looking at primary sources like library holdings on the internet, if you're reading what you believe is supposed to be objective information on a website that's come through the personal filter of the person who controls the website, then you're not really getting the primary source. It's been bent in some way in order to fit the person's agenda. Go to a reference book. Those are pretty reliable. Go to a dictionary. Go to an encyclopedia. Those sorts of reference books have been subjected to scholarly oversight. And so, had somebody asked me about the Pharisees, my first answer would be, go to a Bible dictionary to find out what a Pharisee is. Until I went to a Bible dictionary. And then I realized somehow, even within this reference book that's supposed to be objective, it had been subjected to stereotyping and ethnocentrism. And I'm going to give you a great example. In fact, I'm going to read some things verbatim. But as we're looking at that canon and how those things were put together, we can accept that Bible that's given to us as pretty much right on. There's going to be some discrepancy, more so in the Greek texts than in the Hebrew texts, where it might say in your Bible, well, the earliest manuscripts didn't have this and so forth. But the basic message is pretty much the same across the texts. So we're probably not going to get a distorted first perception of the Pharisees just from the text itself. There's going to have to be some added things in there that kind of subtly twist our way of looking at them. So the best thing to do is start over. And like I said, what would have been my first choice? Just say, well, go to a Bible dictionary. It'll tell you what a Pharisee is. But then the Bible dictionary disappointed me. I saw that it had some of these problems that we're talking about. So let's just take the word Pharisee and the historical summary of who they were. They're going to begin, scholars believe, as a sect of Judaism. And the thing is, in the first century, you cannot say Judaism because it's Judaisms. There's lots of Judaisms in the first century. It's only after the destruction of the Second Temple that you're going to get more of a homogeneous group of people practicing in like way. But where did this particular group of the first century begin? The guess is that they formed in the last half of the 2nd century BC. And if you've ever read the Maccabees that would have taken place during that period, it'll give you an idea of some of the history of Judea and Galilee that was going on at that time and how it fit into the Greek and Roman world. So sometime during that interim period between Malachi and Matthew, they would have evolved. They were known by certain things. They believed in an afterlife. In the first century, not everybody did. To hear a message that there is life after death, that there is judgment after death, that there are beings that we call angels, that wasn't taken for granted in the first century. So that's the greatest gift we can say that the Pharisees gave us, was they put together this doctrine of the afterlife and resurrection of the dead with an actual physical body. Even though it's a transformed body, it's still a body. Like Yeshua made a point. He said, I want you to touch me, handle me. I want you to see that I'm still flesh. Even though it's transformed, I want you to understand what it means to resurrect so that you can understand your own resurrection. And the way he's explaining his resurrection is 100% what the Pharisees have been teaching the people. Now, the Sadducees have been saying, no, that's not how it goes. You just die. When you die, you just fall asleep. That's it. It's all over. You might have the Essenes saying, well, yes, but you're going to be just like this soul, this spirit drifting along out there, and you don't have to be chained to your body anymore. But the Pharisees are saying, no, it's spirit, soul, and body. At the resurrection of the dead, there's going to be a transformation. And we're going to be like the first Adam. We're going to be able to move between the realms there of that spiritual Garden of Eden and the physical. They did also believe in an oral tradition, the oral law, which they would refer to probably as a user's manual for the Torah itself. And the basic definition in Hebrew, a Pharisee is prushim, or they might say prushin. But prushim would be plural, and parush would be singular. To figure out what does that mean, why did they pick that name to describe themselves as prushim or Pharisees? It goes back to the Hebrew three-letter root parash. Parash. And it means to make distinct, to declare, to distinguish, to separate, to clarify, to be distinctly declared, to separate, or to literally separate for the cause of dispersion. All those definitions apply to a Pharisee. They were a distinct religious group. They could be distinguished say, from the Sadducees, who did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. They could be distinguished from, say, an Essene, who thought the answer was to completely withdraw and just form a new community and just not take part in the temple services at all, which we know Yeshua did not do. And their purpose was to distinctly declare the text of the Tanakh, mainly of the Torah, but also of the rest of what we would say is the Old Testament. Nehemiah 8:8, it says, "So they read in the book of the law of God distinctly," that Hebrew word there is parash, "and gave sense, and caused them to understand the reading." So what was a Pharisee? Based on the definition that describes their group, a Perush, or a Pharisee, is going to be a person who desires to give a distinct sense to the Hebrew biblical text and to disperse the knowledge so that the average person can understand it and therefore obey it. Now it should make sense what we have said about why Yeshua rebuked the Pharisees so often. Because remember, the example James gives is not many of you should be teachers because you received the greater condemnation. Why did Yeshua condemn so many Pharisees and their actions? Because of the very definition of a Pharisee, one who desires to give distinct sense to the Hebrew biblical text and to disperse the knowledge so that the average person could understand it and therefore obey it. It was the Pharisees' job to explain so people will understand, and then they can therefore obey that covenant that defines their community. So we'll take this one step further in the next segment. What did this mean?